Okay, and we're recording, so let's get started. Again, I'm Brian. I'll be your host for the next hour. We've got about 40 minutes for an overview, whirlwind tour of what this Holacracy thing is all about. And then we'll take the rest of our time for Q&A. So a couple of things to call your attention to. As we go, please queue up your questions. And you can do that on your Zoom screen. You should see a Q&A link at the bottom. And if you click that, you can use that to log your questions. I won't be able to get to many questions as we go. I might try to answer one or two, but we will have that block at the end, and I'll do everything I can to answer as many questions as possible at that point. And there's also a chat link. So if you click that chat, you should see a little chat panel pop up, and you can use that to share thoughts with us and your fellow attendees. So go ahead and send a chat message if you like. In fact, just to get used to using that, let me ask, where are you connecting in from? What part of the world are you in today? Get a sense of how broad our group is here. So go ahead and type that into the chat and let us know. So I'm going to read some of them. We've got North Carolina, Colorado, South Africa, France, Brazil. We've got at least, one, two, three, four continents covered. The Netherlands, California, Amsterdam, Groningen. I did a training there once. Hello, welcome. The UK, all over Europe, all over the US, and then we've got even South America and Africa covered as well. So welcome. As we go, please do feel free, share anything that comes up for you in the chat, but put your questions in the Q&A so that we can make sure we get the questions captured. Try to keep your chat in the chat so everybody can participate, and the Q&A only goes to us, I believe, so keep your questions in there. And with that said, let me tell you a little bit about me, and then I'll jump in. So I'm Brian. I'm kind of the primary pioneer of this Holacracy method, although lots of people were involved, and this wasn't it's not like I had a theory and then created this thing. I'm an entrepreneur. My background is in building organizations. And about 15 years ago, I started a company because I was just dissatisfied with all my previous experiences in the way I had felt in companies. I felt like I was constantly beating my head against the system of the organization, trying to get work done. And there were so many things in the way of driving meaningful change. So I started a company to be a laboratory. I said, there's just got to be a better way. And I created an organization just to experiment with new ways of working together and running an organization. And Holacracy kind of emerged over many years following that of just doing this in my company. So this wasn't something that came from management theory. This was something that came from an organization trying to experiment in practice to develop better ways of working. And it took many years for what is now Holacracy to develop. Since then, it's spread all over the world. I left that original software company that started this thing and created Holacracy One, the organization hosting this webinar, to spread this method and support its growth in the world. And I'll share some more examples as we go, but at this point it's used by about 1,000 companies all over the world, and it's growing fairly exponentially. So it's kind of a whole movement. And I'm going to try to give you a taste of what it's all about. First, let me tell a story just to kind of give some framing for where this came from. And I'm a private pilot, so I fly airplanes. When I was learning, I was still a student pilot. I had an experience that was rather scary. It was my first cross-country solo flight, which means I'm still a student. I have about 20 hours of flight time under my belt. And believe it or not, with 20 hours of practice, they let you get up in the airplane alone and fly hundreds of miles away from your home airport. So I'm in the plane. I'm struggling to navigate and keep the plane, moving. And along the journey, the low voltage light comes on my instrument panel. And, they don't teach you much about the airplane hardware when you're learning. So I really didn't know what low voltage meant in an airplane. But my instinct was check the other instruments in my control panel. So one by one, I looked at all the other instruments. My altimeter said you're not losing altitude, so there's no problem there. My navigation aids said I'm actually perfectly on course, so no problem there. Plenty of fuel. My airspeed was fine. Every other instrument said there's nothing wrong with the airplane, everything's fine. So my instinct was ignore the low voltage light, right? It must not be that big of a problem because only one instrument is reporting anything anomalous. Turns out that's a really bad decision. I nearly crashed the airplane that day. It turned out that the low voltage light is actually tuned in to information that no other instrument is sensing. And I ended up lost in a storm with no radio, no lights, no navigation, violating international airspace, which is not a good position to be. Fortunately, I did make it down safely, barely, but I did. And as I'm reflecting on this, I realized this is what I do in my company too, accidentally, but often when one person senses something that's off, some issue that is endangering our flight towards our purpose in our company, it's often one lone person that senses things, at least to start. And what I ended up doing as a leader, same thing many do, is I look around, I check, I sense, and do I feel it? Do others? And I end up outvoting the low voltage light, right? I end up letting the majority of people, if they don't sense something, it must not be a problem, we continue on. And I realized I've been on the other side of that, and maybe some of you can relate to this experience. Have you ever been the one in an organization that is sensing something that is in the way of this organization achieving its full potential? It could be something that literally risks crashing the mission, or it could just be a constraint to really fully expressing the purpose here. Have you ever been the person that senses that when not many others do? And if you have had that experience, I think most of us have at some point, it's incredibly difficult to drive change in an organization. So for me, this led to a question. How can I build an organization where we don't outvote the low voltage light? In other words, how can we build an organization where any one person that senses something that could be useful to better express our purpose has somewhere to go where they can get that wisdom integrated into the flight plan or into the way we work around here? How can we make change easy as long as it's grounded in something to serve the purpose, even when it's only sensed by one individual or a minority, or sensed somewhere else in the organization from where the change needs to happen? So that was kind of my founding question as I experimented with this thing and just tried to figure out how can we run an organization differently. That was kind of the question I held at the core. And let me shift here and ask you a question based on that. What do you see that limits useful change? Just share in the chat whatever pops into your head, right? So what limits change in an organization when one person senses something that could be an improvement or could serve our purpose somehow? What gets in the way? What words pop into your head? Type them into the chat. What words pop into your head when somebody senses something and can't drive change? What's limiting it? What are the endemic constraints, the frustrations that we have in organizations? Right, so I'm going to read just a handful of the ones coming out. Fear, the first thing that came up. It's funny. I'd say at least half the time I do this, fear is the first thing that comes up. That must say something, right? How we've always done it. Yeah, sure, absolutely. I see a bunch of things, past experience connecting to that. The power structure, the boss, right? Good luck driving change if the boss doesn't sense it. Sometimes even if the boss does, it takes time and energy to run things up the management hierarchy and get enough buy-in, right? Sometimes all it takes is one key manager or executive who says, no, I don't think that's that important, to crush an entire change initiative. One person not bought in, right? That's fascinating. It's actually the opposite of the way other innovation engines work, like Silicon Valley. In the investment space for startups, all it takes is one investor to say yes to an idea, and the world can change. But in companies, all it takes is one key manager to say no, and the entire initiative is crushed. What else? The organizational structure, the hierarchy, a lot around that. Power, that's an interesting one. Yeah, power gets in the way. The status hierarchies, the egos at play, and all that, for sure. The existing rules, the status quo, yeah, all of that stuff. Ego, I see ego coming up here, right? So there's a lot, and I find it interesting. The things that come up when I ask this question are the same patterns again and again, and it doesn't matter where in the world I'm speaking. When I ask this question, I get similar answers. Doesn't matter what culture I'm in, I get really similar answers. It doesn't matter whether I'm talking to a room full of CEOs from large companies, I get the same answers. Or people in small, tiny companies, I get similar answers, right? So there's something universal about this. And it's not lack of awareness that leads to right? I have yet to meet a CEO who won't say, yep, my organization suffers from at least some of these things some of the time, if not all of them most of the time, right? Uh, but why haven't we solved them yet, right? If this is that common, think of the economic cost in the world today if every organization is suffering from this, let alone the human toll this takes on us. And yet we still suffer from it. And that must mean these are really difficult to transcend, to resolve. And that was my experience. No matter what I tried initially, I felt like I was at best patching symptoms of these. And as I asked myself, why is this so difficult? I kind of came to a conclusion. I don't think these represent things that are somehow going wrong, off track with the way we typically organize. Rather, I think our organizations today are perfectly designed to achieve these results. Right? In other words, instead of this being some, accidental thing that happens sometimes, I think there's something in the fundamental design of our organizational power structures today that predictably, reliably leads to these results. And no wonder it's so hard to get around them, right? If they're somehow fundamentally tied to the way we fundamentally organize, right? That means to transcend these, we've got to really get to the core of how do we organize? How does power work in this company? How do we decide who's going to do what? Who can make which decisions? How do we structure power? Because I think that's what's leading to these. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about that fundamental way we organize power and have for quite some time in our organizations. It's the management hierarchy. We centralize power in a CEO. We give somebody at the top of the hierarchy, by whatever title, executive director, CEO, whatever. We give them almost complete and total power to run the organization almost any way they want. And then they break it down. They can't do everything, so they delegate power, and we create this management hierarchy. This is the way we've organized, again, for a while, and it's so ingrained that most people running organizations don't think of it as a choice. They simply think of it as the way to scale, because it is one way to scale, right? And there are benefits to this. This brings us some way of breaking down the work, getting work breakdown, some way of getting accountability, some way of getting alignment, right? There are things we need that this provides. And if we're going to start talking about alternatives to management hierarchy, we better make sure they provide the same kinds of benefits. We need some way to break down the work. We need some way to make fast decisions sometimes. And at least the CEO can do that sometimes. We need some way to have accountability, there's the clarity. There's so many things this provides us. But I think more and more in the world today, it's not providing enough of those things. The world's changed a lot. If you were an executive in the middle of last century, the complexity you faced was so much smaller. The pace of change was so much slower. And this structure worked pretty well for that world. But for today's world, I think this structure is rapidly becoming obsolete. And I think the first step is just gaining awareness that there are other ways. This is not a fundamental given. You need some way to scale an organization, but there are other approaches in the management hierarchy. And that's fundamentally what Holacracy is. It's a new approach based on a new paradigm or a different paradigm. Maybe not a new paradigm, maybe one that goes back some time. But it's new in our organizations. Most of our organizations are kind of like this centralized planned economy. We try to control everything from the top and break it down. And that works well when you have a level of complexity that's fairly low. But as complexity goes up, it's much harder to control that. And we see that in societies. All of our attempts to get centralized planned economies in society fail. The complexity is too high. Instead, what we have is a very different paradigm, which is one that allows self-organization. In our societies today, our cities, we have frameworks that give us order. There's a framework of laws and structure that allows us something to rely on for how we're going to collaborate with each other across organizational boundaries or across individuals. But the individuals themselves and the individual companies are left quite a bit of freedom to adapt to their local environment, to figure out, what do I want to do with my life, my day. I don't need to call a meeting of my neighborhood to plan my new kitchen design. It's my kitchen. I'm going to design it however I want. If I was in a typical company and I wanted to redesign the kitchen, I'd have to call a meeting of all the key stakeholders, and I'd have to get buy-in. It would be an excruciatingly long process. But in societies, I simply know it's my kitchen. I can design it however I want. I have some autonomy there. And if I want to transact with a contractor or buy some new tile from a store or whatever, I can do that in this framework of law and order that we have. But there's this meshwork of different independent entities working together that allows order to show up as kind of an emergent order, a self-organizing paradigm. And that tends to work pretty well. And we see it in other examples. One of my favorites is the human body. In the human body, we have something we don't really as much in society. We need alignment, right? If I decide to go for a jog, I kind of want every one of my organs to come with me, and I kind of want them to kick into higher gear, right? I want my heart to beat faster, my lungs to inflate more. I need my whole system to organize around this desire of mine to go for a jog. And we do that in the human body, and there's no boss cell, there's no CEO cell that directs the other cells what to do. There's not even a CEO organ, right? That's actually not how the brain works. There's so much self-organization there, and each part has its role, including the brain. But every organ has this self-organizing process, and every cell within the organ has its own self-organizing process. And the organ doesn't destroy the autonomy of the cells. It doesn't command them. It integrates their autonomous self-organizing functions into a larger function. And that paradigm is nature's way of organizing to deal with a vast amount of complexity in a really fluid, flexible way. And we see some of that in societies as well, until we step into our companies, when it's like we've stepped back into the feudal ages, right? So how can we get that kind of paradigm in our companies, in our organizations? And that's what Holacracy does. It's an alternative system. It's a replacement for the management hierarchy. If you think of the management hierarchy as a framework, which it is, management hierarchy doesn't tell you exactly what functions you have and what job titles. It just gives you a framework to organize. And Holacracy gives you an alternate framework. It doesn't tell you how to run your specific company. It lets you figure that out, just like you have to still with the management hierarchy. But it gives you a different way of breaking down power instead of centralizing it in a CEO at the top of a hierarchy and breaking it down a chain of managers. It is a framework. It's a structure. One of the common myths when I talk about Holacracy, and people hear no management hierarchy, which is true. There is no management hierarchy at the end of the day in a company running Holacracy. But that doesn't mean there's no structure. In fact, companies using Holacracy are more structured, not less, than in the typical management hierarchy. We just get to the structure differently, right? Just like societies are highly structured, they're also highly chaotic. Go into a modern city, right? Walk out into the streets of Amsterdam. It's one of my favorite cities. I spent a lot of time there. It's highly ordered and highly chaotic both. And there's this adaptation that happens. It's vibrant, it's alive. As cities grow, they tend to get more innovative. The innovation per resident increases, but as companies grow, the opposite happens. And so they're using order. There is structure. There's just a different way of getting it than we see in our companies. So let me get a little more concrete with some of what you need and some of what Holacracy provides. Ironically, it provides the very things that we often think of getting in the way of agile organization, because they often do. In most management hierarchies, right, you see the policies, the rules, the structure, it gets in the way. It's not requisite, it's not natural. So it's annoying, it's frustrating. And the first move a lot of people intuitively get when they want to get a more flexible, dynamic, agile work environment is let's throw out the structure, the constraints, the policies, the boundaries, all that stuff. And you may need to throw out a lot of the ones that are in place today, but if you don't replace them with something, you don't get empowerment. If you're a leader and you go and you tell your team, guess what, guys, from today on, there are no rules anymore. You can do anything that makes sense to you. You don't get an empowering environment. You get people intuitively sensing there must really be some limit on what I can do, but it's not clear. So I'm going to spend all my time and energy trying to make sure everyone's okay with everything I do. And you fall into what I call the tyranny of consensus, where nothing gets done because everyone's trying to build buy-in all the time, right? Or you fall into everyone checking with the former boss. There's a shadow power structure that comes up because people know there really are some constraints. So Holacracy kind of goes a different direction. It says, sure, let's get rid of the bureaucratic ones, but let's focus on clarifying what are the limits. Because if you don't know the limits on your power, you don't know your power. right? If you don't know what you can't decide, you don't know what you can decide without checking with anyone. So Holacracy's focus is clarifying what are the minimally sufficient constraints that we need to keep the whole system safe and healthy. Because once those are clear, you can give people complete freedom within them to do anything that makes sense to them to get their job done. So Holacracy gives you a way of clarifying all this. And let me give you an example of what this looks like. So Holacracy is a role-based system. It breaks down work into clear roles. Each role is a defined chunk of work. This is not like a job description. There's some similarities, but more differences. A role is a micro unit of work. So I fill 30 roles in my company, right? So it's not just one giant job description, and it's not something we just wrote once up front. Roles start very lightweight, and we add to them as we learn together. And I'll come back to how that works. So here's one role I'm filling right now, Holacracy spokesperson. I'm doing that role right now with you all. Every role in Holacracy has a purpose. Holacracy is a purpose-driven system, and it focuses on breaking down the purpose of the overall organization into a purpose in each role. Right? So my role has a purpose to crystallize and convey the Holacracy brand, reveal its why to the world, why Holacracy. So that purpose gives me a basic level of power in my role. And I have some accountabilities too. I'll come back to them. These are what others can expect of me, and also gives me some sense of what I need to do in this role. But here's the key rule of Holacracy. When you have a role in the system, you have the full authority to make any decision or take any action to get your job done, to express the purpose of your role or one of your accountabilities, as long as there's no rule against it. This is actually pretty profound in that most companies work exactly the opposite. In most organizations today, there's an implicit norm. Don't do anything outside of what you ordinarily do without getting permission, or someone's going to get mad. And you get permission in one of two ways in most companies. You either run it up the management hierarchy and talk to the boss or the boss's boss or whatever. Or, more common actually, you build buy-in from your whole team. You call a meeting, you socialize it, you talk to all your stakeholders, you make sure everyone's comfortable with your intended decision, which is an incredibly slow process. And that's how you get permission. If you want to test if that's really the culture in your company, try going and taking autocratic authority and making a bold decision completely outside your ordinary way of working that affects others, and see how pissed off people get at you. That's a surefire sign, if that happens, that you've got the opposite of this in place. So Holacracy turns that on its head. It says the first rule is if there's not an explicit rule actually captured, and I'll talk about how that gets captured in a minute, but if there's not a clear, explicit constraint, a rule against something, then you don't need to socialize and you don't need to go to a boss. There is no boss. You have the full authority to use your judgment, be autonomous, and autocratically make any decision or take any action to serve your role's purpose. And if that triggers some tension for someone else, we're going to learn from that, and we're going to define the minimally sufficient rules that we need to honor to keep things safe together. Right? So we're going to learn from that tension instead of trying to prevent it all up front by socializing everything or running things up the hierarchy. So first golden rule. Now, let me show you another way for how we can put a rule in place. So this is another role I work with. This is our web architect role filled by a colleague of mine. It has its own purpose, a clear and sexy website for Holacracy and my company, Holacracy One. And this role has what we call a domain. So think of this as the role's property. This role controls our website, right? It's the property of this role. And that's a signal to me in my spokesperson role and to every other role that works with them, that if you want to change the website, you need to actually talk to this role and make sure it's not going to cause harm. So that's part of this way of defining these boundaries. So again, I have the authority in my spokesperson role. I can do anything I want to express my role's purpose, unless there's a rule against it. And there is a rule against messing with the website without this role's permission. So in this way, we kind of break down the property rights, if you will. Like in society, right? I know to lead my life, I have a pretty wide degree of freedom. I can do whatever makes sense to me to express my purpose in the world, as long as there's no explicit rule against it. There's some laws I can't break, and I can't go take my neighbor's property, right? I can't say, well, hey, my purpose, I need to go to the airport. I'm flying out tomorrow, so I'm going to go take my neighbor's car and drive it to the airport. He's got a nice new car. I think that'd be a nice ride. right? I know that's his property and I need his permission before I take his car. Um, that kind of clarity of distributed property rights gives us a framework in which I don't need to go talk to a local baron to see if it's okay to use the communal property, right? I know that's his to control. I know it's mine to control. And Holacracy uses the same kind of decentralized, centralized control. It's an interesting paradox there, right? This is centralizing control of our website in this role. But it doesn't matter it doesn't matter if I'm the founder of the company. I don't get to control that website. I don't get to tell this role what to do. It's this role's property, and it gets to serve its purpose and govern that property as it sees fit. So that's one way we get this dynamic kind of framework where people have this level of basic empowerment. But that's not enough. If you want to see this whole thing collapse in bureaucracy, you can make one of the most common mistakes people make when they start Holacracy. They go and try to define all the roles they have in their company and all of the domains, all the property of all the different roles, and all the accountabilities on all those roles. And they create a bureaucratic nightmare. They create a system that is so over-designed, right, that nobody can go do anything without checking with somebody again. It's a mess. You have to look it up all the time. It's painful. So the principle we use when we're helping organizations adopt Holacracy and coaching through it, start as lightweight as possible. So these roles don't start fully defined. Most roles start only with a purpose, right? And maybe one accountability and an unspecified purpose that we can just infer until we capture it later. So roles start really lightweight and rarely with a domain. Instead, we just start lightweight. We give smart people good roles and we say, go do what makes sense to you. And let's see when we need to change things based on what we learn together. So you're going to need a process. If you want this empowering environment, you need to start lightweight and have a process to evolve the rules, to evolve the boundaries, to add the domains when you learn they're really needed, to add accountabilities when you learn what you really need to expect from each other, instead of trying to define it all up front. This needs to be an evolutionary process. And Holacracy does that by adding a governance process in every team or every circle, as we call it. So this is our outreach circle, that's our marketing. And every one of these green and blue bubbles there is a role. So my spokesperson role is in there. There's our web architect role is in this team. And once every month or so, might be a little more frequent for new teams, but once every month or so, there's a governance meeting that anyone filling a role in this team is invited to attend. So our web architect's invited, I'm invited as our spokesperson, there are others that are invited. And in this meeting, we can propose changing any other role in the circle. Now, we don't use the governance process to make specific decisions, right? We never use this process to decide what should our new website look like, or should we use Drupal or WordPress for our new website, right? We're never making decisions like that as a group. Instead, we're using the process to decide what role defines what website platform we use, what role chooses that, what role designs the website, right? So we're not making the decision about what we should do, we're structuring the framework of how the team operates together. What can I expect of our web architect role? What can the web architect expect of me, right? This is where we add accountabilities to roles, where we add domains to roles, right? We define what the role controls and what we expect of it. We can add new roles in the team. We can split roles in two. We can do anything we want. And there's a defined meeting process for that governance meeting. It's not using consensus, but it is giving everyone a voice. It's a really cool little process. In fact, my colleague here from Holacracy One, Laura, can you share a link for us to that the meeting video we have? If you want to see what the governance meeting looks like, we have a page on our website that kind of walks you through the meeting process, so you can see that if you want to watch that after. But let me give an example of how it worked. This is a real example, and I think a pretty cool one. So I'm going to go back to my spokesperson role. So when we first created this spokesperson role, we started it with just a purpose and I think one accountability. So again, it starts really lightweight, and I just go do the work as best I can. And I was doing that just fine, and one of my colleagues had some tension, though. I have another role on this team, or not me, sorry, a colleague of mine fills this other role called casting agent. And our casting agent role books me, our spokesperson, for speaking engagements, for talks. And we get a lot of invitations for that. We get a lot of invites to speak at conferences and things like that. So our casting agent was feeling some tension because she would negotiate with the conference. She'd get an invitation. She'd talk to them. She'd negotiate. She'd find what she thought was a good arrangement, and then she'd present it to me, and I'd say, no, I'm not going to go to that one. It's the wrong market or wrong audience or just not worth my time, whatever, different criteria I had. And she felt completely disempowered, right? She'd done all this time and work, and then at the end of her process, I'd shoot it down. So she went to a governance meeting, and she said, look, to do my role better, to get rid of this disempowering constraint of my role, I need to expect something from the spokesperson. So she proposed adding an accountability on my role, and it's this third accountability here. Defining criteria for acceptable speaking engagements. That's where this came from, right? She said, if I could read your criteria for what engagement you would accept, then I could apply that criteria up front, and I wouldn't waste my time negotiating with something that was the wrong market or wrong audience or whatever. And so she proposed that, and it took maybe 2-3 minutes in that governance meeting, and it ended up that we added that accountability to my role. And then after the meeting, she now has the ability to turn to me and say, okay, great, so when do you think you're going to get that criteria published for me by? Now, the interesting part of this story, it took about 3 minutes to make this change and get that new expectation added to my role. The interesting thing, she was our newest hire right out of college. I'm the founder of the company. In what organization do you know where the newest hire right out of college in 3 minutes can get an expectation added onto the founder and then turn to him and say, so when do you think you're going to have that done for me by? Right? I think that's actually pretty incredible. The status didn't matter. There is no management hierarchy here getting in the way. The titles don't matter. There are none, really, in our company. All that matters is she has a role and I have a role. And to get her job done and express the purpose of her role, she needed to expect something from my role. And in that process, again, you can dig in afterwards if you like, I have a chance to say, will that cause harm in my ability to get my role done? I don't get to just say, no, I don't like it. The question on the table is, do I see any reasons it will cause harm in my ability to do my work if we add that expectation, which I didn't. And even if I do, that doesn't stop the process. It just gives us a cool, creative puzzle to solve. So really cool process and an example of this distributed authority system here, where the status and all that stuff doesn't matter. There's simply a governing framework that makes it easy to learn together. We learned that we need to expect that from my role in order to serve our overall purpose together better. Right? That is the governance process in Holacracy that allows you to evolve anything on a team. And it's that evolution is driven from real tensions, right? We're not defining all these accountabilities up front. We are using the real tensions, the learning from working together to drive change. So this is an emergent structure. It's an organizational design that shows up from real people trying to get work done and learning how to do it better together. And so again, that's kind of a simple glimpse into how this works. Now imagine that happening not just on one team, but on every team throughout your organization. Because that's how this works. So in Holacracy, the governance meeting isn't just done in some management team at the top. There is no management team. There are circles, and each circle has a purpose, and every circle is doing regular governance meetings. And as you get better at it, governance can also happen through an asynchronous process outside of meetings. And that can cover like 80% of your needs on a typical team for simple changes. And then the meetings get really focused on the deeper governance changes you need to make to the roles. And ironically, what these meetings do is free more people to make autocratic decisions with no meeting needed. Right? Once we know what we can expect of each other and who has the authority to make which decision, you don't need a meeting to make decisions. You simply go lead your role and make any decision that serves the purpose of your role, as long as there's no rule against it. You know what others can expect of you. You don't need a meeting for that, right? To enact that. The governance meeting gives you the framework that you can then go and autocratically execute. So it's pretty cool, and it's happening at every level of scale. Some circles include sub-circles, right? And in that case, there's some representatives, some links that connect the circles. I won't go into that in depth, but you can read more about that in my book, or I'll leave you some other places to go for more information. So there's kind of a cross-connecting of different circles that happens to make sure tensions can flow from one circle to another circle. The broader circle here, we call it our GCC, our general company circle. That's governing the intersection of our subcircles. So that's governing what does our service delivery team need to expect from our outreach team, right? Or what does our Glassfrog team, they develop a software package where all these screenshots came from for structuring an organization this way, right? What does that team need to expect from our service delivery team or vice versa? So the broader circle is structuring the connections and the expectations between the circles. And then in every circle, they're breaking down their work and figuring out how to get their job done. So this is a very fractal kind of organic structure, right? And it scales. This is a picture at one point in time of Zappos' structure. There's 1,600 employees doing Holacracy throughout, and there are literally thousands of roles and hundreds of circles in this screenshot. And this is changing. What I love about this screenshot looks completely different than what their structure looks like today because it's organic, it's living. The circles themselves are getting split and combined and reshaped as we learn how to better structure the work of this entity. The roles are changing, and people can fill roles in many circles. You're not just pigeonholed in one part of the management hierarchy. You're liberated to go find the best role profile or constellation for you. So you can fill roles in lots of different circles throughout the organization, which is pretty liberating. In Zappos, there's one guy that was kind of a party planner, did party planning roles. They called the role Fungineer. I was talking to him a little while back, and he was really excited because he just got some new roles in their marketing circle. Totally different part of the organization than party planning. But he loved it, and he said he wouldn't have been able to do that in the management hierarchy. He would have been stuck in one place. But now he can form this role constellation that really uniquely leverages his talent and his passions and branch out into new areas with a part-time role here and a part-time role there. So pretty liberating what this kind of more organic structure can do. And the last major piece I want to introduce here is this whole structure has rules like any good game, right? If you want to keep power out of the hands of one CEO who holds it all at the top and breaks it down a management hierarchy, you need somewhere else to put power. And Holacracy's place to put power is a constitution. So just like societies, if you want to get power from a king at the top of a feudal empire, and you want to get that into some other framework or system, one really powerful answer is you write down the way power works in a constitution, and you have the king sign a declaration ceding the power of the monarchy into a constitutional process. We have a long history of doing that societally to take a leap to a new, more peer-to-peer decentralized power structure. And Holacracy does the same. So the first move a company makes when they want to adopt Holacracy, and by the way, try it first. There's different ways to get a taste of it, but once you're really ready to adopt it, it's for the CEO to sign a declaration adopting the Holacracy Constitution as the power structure for the organization. Now, the CEO can retain the right to throw it out if it doesn't work for them. In fact, that's an important right to retain, at least until you write it into your legal bylaws, which some companies have done, but don't do that up front. Instead, adopt it. Say, we're going to play by these rules of the game, and that gives everyone permission to hold even the CEO to those rules. Gives everyone permission to turn to the CEO sometimes and say, thanks for your advice, but this is my role, so I'm going to lead it in a different direction. Right? Fascinating when somebody does that to the former CEO. And so it also on the CEO side, as a former CEO, I love this. When somebody starts trying to defer their power to me by asking me to make all the difficult decisions that they really should be making themselves, I can actually push it back on them now and say, look, according to the Constitution, I don't actually have the power to make that decision. That's your decision to make, not mine. Good luck. If you want some coaching, I'm happy to give you some advice or some help, but let's be clear, the burden of leadership is on you, not me, for this role, right? Which is a much more empowering stance. That helps CEOs be the kind of leaders who create leaders, not the kind who direct followers. So really interesting dynamic that happens when you take power from the office of a CEO and put it in a constitutional process. Like any sport, the rules of the game are in a rule book, not in one person that can make up the rules as they go. And you can find the Holacracy Constitution online. Good news, you don't have to rewrite this yourself. You don't have to define it yourself. There is a generic constitution for Holacracy that spells out the rules of Holacracy's role-based system and its governance process. So it's just a framework. It doesn't tell you what roles you should have. That's up to you. It doesn't tell you what processes you should have. That's up to you. It just gives you the meta framework. Here is the governance process, and here's the definition of roles, and the power roles get once you create them. You still have to do the work of creating the roles and evolving the roles. So this isn't a one-size-fits-all system. It's a framework. It's not telling you how to do everything in your company. It's just giving you a framework for how to decide that yourself. Right? So that's what this constitution does. It's an open source document. It evolves. This is version 4.1. We're currently working on 5.0. And it's evolved in the same way open source software is. Think of it like an operating system for your computer, but this is a social operating system for your organization. And it evolves from the network of companies. There's about 1,000 companies in the world that are using this constitution as their core power structure, and then defining their roles and their processes within its framework. And the framework itself evolves just like operating systems do, through feedback from all of the many users of this as we find the edge cases and continue to improve the system itself. So with all that said, very brief summary, Holacracy shifts us from static job descriptions that never change and get irrelevant quick to dynamic roles that are constantly evolving based on learning in every team. It shifts us from delegating authority down a management hierarchy to constitutional authority, which means we no longer need large-scale reorgs like in typical big companies. Instead, we have constant iteration that's driven by real tensions. We're constantly iterating. We're doing micro reorgs in every governance meeting on every team every month. And that means we have a completely different way to get alignment. We don't need to socialize things and play politics to get alignment in a company. We have a governance process to get us alignment based on the needs of the work, not based on politics. So with all those shifts, you end up with a new social technology, a new generic approach to building and running a company that replaces end-to-end the management hierarchy. It's a proven system now. It's not perfect, but I think in most cases it's better than the management hierarchy at what it does. It doesn't need to be perfect to add value. It just needs to be better than whatever you're replacing. It certainly has issues and it keeps evolving itself, but it is the first that I'm aware of complete end-to-end replacement for power resting in a CEO and then breaking down a management hierarchy. So with that said, I'm going to move into our Q&A block, and I'll leave you at the very end if you want to learn more. In fact, actually, I'll share some of that now, and then for those who are ducking out before the questions, if you want to learn more, our website is a wealth of information. You can find resources, there's videos, we have a whole YouTube channel with lots of little videos on different aspects of this. So check out our website. The Holacracy book is out there. You can buy it anywhere you buy books. Check that out. There's lots of more detail in there. But the best way to really learn Holacracy is to get an experience of it. It's kind of like, it's hard to learn a sport by reading about it if you haven't seen it played. And this is very much a practice, a sport like that. So the best way to learn it is to experience it. And you have two ways you can experience it. If you're a company and you're thinking about adopting it, you can bring in a coach. We do this work, and we have a network of licensees all over the world who do this work. You can bring in a coach to do a little workshop with a key team to give them a hands-on taste of how Holacracy would structure the work of that team. We call that a little Holacracy discovery session. Also serves to kind of help you get started if you're gonna start this. So reach out to us if you're interested in getting an in-house taste with a key team in your company of what this would be like on your real issues. That's a great way. If you're not in a position to do that, or you're not wanting to do that yet, another way to get a taste is to go to a workshop or training. And if you can, Laura, share our events link there for me. You can find on our website, there are trainings, everything from little half-day workshops that give you a little taste, to we do a 4.5-day training, which is a deep dive into Holacracy with lots of simulations, so you really get the feel of what it's like to live in this, as well as how to actually facilitate its processes and how to kind of navigate the overall rule set of Holacracy. So you can find those. We have them coming up. Our next one is in later September in Amsterdam. We do trainings in Amsterdam every 3 or 4 months or so. And we also have one coming up in October in San Francisco. We do San Francisco about once a year. So if you're interested in that, next one's in October. Check it out. We also have one in Sydney, if you're anywhere near that part of the world, coming up in early November. And then you'll find more on our website as well. So those are all different ways you can kind of get a taste of this. With that said, I'm going to take the rest of our time and answer as many questions as I can. I see there are a huge number of questions, so I apologize in advance if I don't get to yours, but I'll do what I can. Okay, so let's see. Here's a good one. What if somebody within their domain or their role makes a really bad decision? So let me ask this. What if somebody in a management hierarchy makes a really bad decision? Right? Does that happen ever? I'd say probably it does. So Holacracy isn't designed to prevent bad decisions from happening any more than a management hierarchy is. In fact, if anything, Holacracy enables them more. Right? In a management hierarchy, one of the ethics is often lock down everything to prevent bad decisions. Still doesn't actually prevent them. And you probably prevent a lot of good decisions along with it. Holacracy says, you know what? Let's embrace bad decisions and let's learn from them. So that sounds like a tension. If somebody in their role makes a bad decision, you might feel tension about it. Right? And that tension can teach us what we need to evolve. Maybe you need a constraint so that that particular type of bad decision can never get made again. Right? You can go to governance and you can propose a policy that constrains what they can do. Or maybe you need to actually expect something from them. Maybe they made a bad decision because they didn't know to do something, and you realize that you were expecting them to do something they didn't do. Well, then you might need an accountability on their role. Go to governance and propose it. Right? It's possible they're just a bad fit for the role. Right? All the governance is clear. The constraints are clear, and they still are just making really bad decisions. Maybe they're just not a good fit for that work. Well, there's another role in Holacracy that gets to decide who fills which roles. Now, that role can't tell the person what to do in their role. They can't approve work. They can't hire or fire the person, but they can give roles to the person and reassign them when there's a better fit. So every circle has a role called a lead link, which has the ability to do that. It's in that sense, it's one function that we kind of associate with a manager, but it's not a manager. They can't fire. They can't tell you what to do. All they get to do is figure out, are you the right fit for your role? And if not, get a better fit in place. And you then go and fill the 29 other roles or whatever you have in other parts of the organization. So there's lots of possible answers to what happens when somebody makes a bad decision. The key is Holacracy, it's not trying to prevent it all. It's trying to help you learn rapidly from it. If you know a bad decision might be likely and you don't think it's safe enough to wait to see if it happens, that too is attention. Go propose a constraint in advance. Most constraints you don't need to propose in advance. It's safe enough to see what happens and learn from it. But there are some that you want to prevent in advance. Great, go propose something. So again, the goal isn't to have all the answers and figure this out all up front. It's just to make sure you have a system that learns rapidly, that adapts rapidly, and that gives you the minimally sufficient rules to keep things safe while allowing people to use their judgment and adapt. All right, so let's see, another question. How do you convince management to do this? Are they afraid to lose status and power? Yeah, so it's really difficult to bring this in from the bottom of an organization, but it is possible to adopt it in one team or one department in a larger company. And there are several examples of name brand, large companies, global companies that have adopted Holacracy in one team or one department. But you do need a manager, at least of that team or department, if not the CEO of the whole organization, who has enough vision for this and wants this enough to say, I'm going to learn a new way to use power. So you don't need every manager in the system to believe that. They're going to learn by doing. And if the CEO says, this is our power structure now, right, people are going to have to either adapt to that or say, you know what, I want to go somewhere else with a more comfortable, familiar power structure. And that happens. This is a disruptive change. In that sense, you are changing people's sense of status and of self-worth. If managers are getting their self-worth from being a directive leader that has so many direct reports, this is going to undermine that. And they're going to have to find a new way to get their self-esteem needs met. So this is disruptive to people's sense of identity sometimes, and not just the managers. This is just as prevalent on the front line, where people are often scared of stepping up and truly taking on real power and leadership. So it's on both sides. And good luck convincing a CEO or manager that doesn't want to do it. It's really hard, but you don't need to. Well, you need to, but only for that one person who can adopt the Constitution. What you need is some CEO or manager over a department that says, in my team, company, department, whatever, this Constitution is now the law of the land. This is now the power structure of the company. Getting them enough comfort to say that takes an experience of it usually. So I never try to tell people, adopt Holacracy, that's crazy. Instead, why don't you take 2 days and do a little workshop to try Holacracy and see if it makes sense to you. And that's the most common path into this. It's not adopt from scratch. It's let's do this little 2-day workshop with our real issues and see what this would do with them and how it would structure us. And from there, the experience of it is usually what convinces. So just some thoughts. It's really hard to, it's not something you're going to be selling people on. It's something they're going to be experiencing and selling themselves on. So what you can do is just make it easier for them to get a taste of it. Okay, let's see. Let's see, another question. How does collaboration work within an organization like this? So if everyone has this high degree of autocratic authority, autonomy, how do we surface solutions that might, that might be better made by some kind of group process? Well, the really cool thing of having autonomy in your role is that you get to choose how much input or collaboration this particular decision is worth, right? So if you're deciding, what kind of pens or pencils should I stock our office with, you probably don't need to use a collaborative process, right? Number 2 or number 3 pencils. Just go make a decision. And if somebody doesn't like it, they'll tell you, and you can adapt. But if you're deciding, what new market should we get into with our services next? That might benefit from scheduling a brainstorming meeting, right? Getting other roles that are relevant involved and getting some input. It's up to you. This isn't saying never collaborate. It's saying know your autonomy, and you decide when the collaboration is worth it. Unless you have an accountability, then honor that. So if you want to govern, mandate collaboration, which you might for certain decisions, just add an accountability. Add an accountability for getting input from these other roles before making this decision. But otherwise, it's up to the person filling the role. And the shift here is subtle, but really powerful. Have you noticed the difference? What I see in management hierarchies often is somebody goes into a meeting and they're uncomfortable owning and leading the power of their role, right? For good reason. Management hierarchies don't want this, right? So they go into a meeting and they say something like, yeah, hey, we need to choose a new platform for our website. So what do you think we should decide? WordPress, Drupal, what do you think? And they start socializing. They might already know what they think is best, but they start socializing. There's a lot of we language. We should decide this, but we doesn't decide things. We is a horrible worker, right? We doesn't get things done. Individuals do, maybe with support of other individuals. So notice the difference between that way of approaching it versus what I see in companies that have gotten good holacracy practice instilled. You might see somebody showing up in a meeting still to collaborate, but now it comes like this. Somebody might say, yes, as our web architect, I need to make a decision about the new web platform for our new website. And to help me make the best decision I can, I'd like to get some input from your roles on what's important to you all so that I can make a decision. There's much more power in that. There's ownership. There's leadership. Which one do you want on your team? The person that defers their power to the group and hides behind we, right? Or the person that says, hey, look, I need to make a decision to lead my role forward. And to do that, I'd like some input, right? And then as soon as they have enough input, they call it. They don't wait for consensus. They say, okay, you know what? I've got enough input to integrate and make my decision. Thank you. And if you have any tension about how I'm making this decision, go to governance and propose whatever accountabilities or constraints you need, and I will honor them. Until then, you've charged me with leading my role, and I'm going to lead it. So ironically, when I see that ethic deeply instilled in an organization, collaboration increases, not decreases. Consensus seeking decreases. Collaboration increases. I think that's a really interesting thing. There's freedom to collaborate when you're not worried about getting stuck in a group decision process. There's freedom to get input when you know you can just get 5 minutes of input and then call it and be done without crippling your ability to go lead because you now have opened a can of worms. Collaboration tends to be higher when you have clarity of leadership and it's distributed. All right, great. So other things, how are conflicts between roles resolved? So conflicts between roles are often resolved in governance, right? What do you need to expect from another role? Like my example, I shared my casting agent role was booking me for talks that I would turn down. And that's a conflict between roles, but she goes and proposes an accountability so that we don't have to wrestle with that conflict anymore. Right? So it's pretty cool. All right, let's see. Other questions. Here's one. I thought Zappos stopped using Holacracy once they were acquired by Amazon. No, Zappos started using Holacracy after getting acquired by Amazon. And they are still using it to this day. There's a lot of myths out there, and don't believe what you read in the press. They tend to get this story wrong more than right. Zappos is doing great. There's, of course, huge challenges when changing your power structure, and Zappos has certainly faced their share of challenges. But as far as I can see, they're tackling those challenges awesomely and moving forward. Yeah, again, the press tends to like to sensationalize challenges, but there's really more more to the story than I think the press tends to report on. And I'll leave it at that for now. So let's see. What else do we have? What other questions here? What are the biggest challenges when adopting Holacracy in a larger organization? Yeah, there's a unique challenge. Large companies are hard, right? It's hard to change the power structure in a larger company that's been around for a while. There are many challenges. It's hard to list all of them. The biggest one is this is really hard to do right without support. Imagine trying to play soccer well when you've never played the game, you've never watched the game, you've just read the rule book, which is, by the way, a terrible way to learn soccer. The FIFA manual for soccer is 144 pages. Good luck learning soccer by reading that. Without at least a good coach. So one of the bigger challenges for any company adopting this, it's hard to do it on your own. It's possible. There are companies that succeed with no outside support and no training even. They just read the book. It's just incredibly rare. The failure rate is very, very high. The failure rate goes down if you at least send somebody to a training, and it goes down a chunk more if you get a good coach. In a big company, that goes from, it's really, really important. So at least get training, if not get a good coach. They can walk you through many of the common pitfalls and help you avoid them. There are many. I mentioned one was over-designing the structure up front. That's one. Another is trying to run in parallel management hierarchy and Holacracy. That's what Medium did wrong. If you see some of the stories about Medium, they were doing partial Holacracy for a while, but they weren't shifting the full power structure to that. They still had a strong operating management hierarchy, and they were trying to do the two in parallel, and that doesn't work. Within a bigger company, you can still have management hierarchy around the team. This is one of the challenges. But in the team that adopts, in the department or team doing Holacracy, needs to be clear that power does not rest with the management hierarchy anymore. It rests with the roles created through governance and the Constitution. You can do that in one team with a broader management hierarchy around you. You then need to just translate across that boundary so that others can, understand how your team works, and you don't have to teach them Holacracy. You can show up to them in a way that they're used to. But in the team, you need to shift power fully into Holacracy. This split mode tends to not work and fail. So there's that. One last question, and then I will wrap since we're out of time. What kind of organizations does this work in? Small volunteer groups, yes. 3-people companies adopt Holacracy often. In universities, yes. There's a university in, where is it? In Switzerland that is doing Holacracy. BSL is the name of it. In their business school. Business school is on. And there's other academic organizations as well that are just starting to play with it. Government agencies, there's a department in the state of Washington that has about 200 people running with Holacracy. There's a government agency in Dubai, several hundred people, and a second government agency in Dubai that's about to start with Holacracy. So there are government agencies. There are not every industry, but a wide variety of industries. There doesn't seem to be a limit. In other words, any organization that could choose to run with a management hierarchy is a perfectly valid candidate to run with Holacracy instead. It's solving the same issues as management hierarchy. How do you break down work? Who's accountable for what? Who makes which decisions? These are all the issues management hierarchy addresses. Holacracy just addresses them differently and more flexibly. So any company that could possibly run with a management hierarchy can probably run with Holacracy. The question is just, is it worth the cost of the change? Because it is a disruptive change, and there is a relearning, a learning curve to it. So with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you all for joining. I really appreciate you sticking with me through the questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to answer all of them. If you have questions that aren't answered that you'd like to get answered, we have a community forum online on our website. Click on our community link, and you can post your questions there and hear from all different coaches and people in companies living this every day that read those forums and post on them. You can also reach out and contact us if you want help. We do coaching, we have trainings. If there's anything we can do to support you, let us know. We have a network of licensees all over the world that does that in other places. So please reach out, and we're happy to put you in touch with somebody who can help you. Again, let us know what we can do to best serve you as you venture into alternate ways of organizing. So thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it. One thing I'll leave you with, Laura, could you post a link to the Why Holacracy video? If you'd like to hear from companies, people in companies doing this, we made a 5-minute video with lots of little interview snippets from companies that are living this every day and doing this, and I think that'd be a great way to end if you take 5 minutes to just hear from some people that are living this every day and what it's done for them and the impact it's had. Laura will post that in just a minute here in the chat. And with that said, I will leave it here. I really appreciate your time. Thanks again for joining. Let us know how we can support your journey through Holacracy. Thanks a lot, and have a great day. And running forward with it with more autonomy and more self-direction. I think a lot of founders seek out Holacracy because they're overwhelmed with
Hello? Hello?